Hey everyone. Some stories were never meant to be forgotten. Tonight we enter the world of Elagabalus, Rome's teenage emperor, a boy who ruled with desire, decadence, and forbidden pleasures. In his palace, lust became ritual, excess became power, and identity defied every expectation of the empire. We'll walk through a court where beauty and scandal intertwined, where the boundaries of pleasure and devotion blurred, and where a young ruler dared to live beyond the rules of his time. So find a quiet place, turn off the lights, and let your mind drift into this world. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, leave a like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate the work that I do. And let me know what time it is where you are, and where you're listening from. It's amazing how many of us gather here to remember history together. Listen, lean closer to the fire. See how the embers pulse like a failing heart, how the shadows dance like ghosts on the wall. It is in such a light, or a light very much like it, that our story begins. Not here with us, but in a time when the world was growing old, when the greatest story ever told was reaching its final tattered chapter, the story of Rome. In those days, the sun itself seemed weary. It was no longer the fierce, conquering Sol Invictus of the Aureus coins, but a pale, watery sovereign ruling over a diminished sky. It rose late and set early, casting long skeletal shadows that stretched from the Palatine Hill to the crumbling Hadrian's Wall in misty Britannia. It was a sun of cataracts and tired sighs, its light a thin, gilded wash on a city that had forgotten its own name. Rome was a grand mausoleum, dreaming of its own funeral. The marble of the Forum, once a brilliant, blinding white, had gone grey and tired, veined with moss and disillusion. Statues of the great men, Augustus, Trajan, Aurelius, stood in their alcoves like forgotten ancestors at a feast, their stone eyes staring blankly at a future they would not have recognized and certainly would not have approved of. Pigeons nested in the helmet of a bronze Mars, and grime gathered like tears in the crevices of Venus's smile. The decay was more than stone deep. It was in the marrow of the empire. In the Senate, men with ancient names and flaccid souls no longer debated the fate of legions or the founding of cities. They argued over the proper vintage of Falernian wine to serve at a disgraced governor's recall banquet, or the scandalous cost of imported silk for the emperor's new curtains. Their virtue was a garment, donned for public viewing and discarded in private for more comfortable vices. They spoke of honor with mouths slick with grease, of duty while their slaves fanned them into a stupor. They were hollow men, echoing the hollow glory of their city. The gods too had fallen silent. The sacrifices were made, the rituals observed, but the gestures were brittle, performed without faith. A priest would slit a bull's throat and read the entrails with the same bored professionalism a clerk might use to tally grain shipments. There was no omen, no divine shudder in the air. The heavens were empty. Jupiter was a myth for children, Juno a petulant caricature. The great heart of the Roman spirit had ceased to beat, and no one had noticed the moment it went still. The chill of this ending was felt even at the edges of the world. A cold, damp wind snaked through the porticos of Rome, smelling of river mud and endings. But the world is a vast and contrary thing. While one sun sets, another may be poised to rise. Far away, across the immense aquamarine sheet of the Mare Nostrum, and deep into the scorched lands of the east, that same tired sun was a different beast entirely. In the Roman province of Syria, in the ancient city of Emesa, the sun was not a weary emperor. It was a god, a ravenous, incandescent, living god. Here the wind carried no damp chill. It was a hot, dry breath called the Khamsin, a sculptor that carved the dunes into fluid mountain ranges and polished the sky to a fierce sapphire blue. It smelled not of decay, but of sand, of spice, of sun-baked stone, and of something else, the heady, intoxicating perfume of absolute faith. In the heart of Emesa stood a temple, not of cool, rational marble, but of dark, imposing basalt. And at the heart of that temple lay its god, a great conical black stone, a beetle fallen from the heavens, pulsing with a heat that had nothing to do with the daylight. This was the seat of Elagabalus, the sun god, the mountain god, the unconquered. And here, amidst the shimmering heat and the ceaseless hypnotic chanting, was a boy. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was 14 years old, though he possessed the grave solemnity of an old man and the unblemished beauty of a girl. His skin was the color of pale olives, his hair a cascade of black silk. His eyes, rimmed in kohl in the Eastern fashion, were vast and dark, holding the night sky in their depths. He was the hereditary high priest of Elagabalus, and the god lived in him. You would not have seen a Roman in him, not at first. He moved with a languid, serpentine grace that was entirely foreign to the stiff-backed gait of a centurion. He was draped not in sensible woolen togas, but in swathes of purple and gold silk, fabrics so fine they seemed to float around him. Bells tinkled at his ankles, and his slender arms were heavy with bracelets of gold and lapis. He was a creature of sensation, of pure, undiluted belief. Watch him now. The ceremony is at its height. The temple court is a dizzying vortex of sound and scent. Priests in white linen beat upon taut-skinned drums, the rhythm a frantic heartbeat. Others shake the sistrum, its metallic rattle cutting through the air like a swarm of locusts. The air is thick, almost solid, with the smoke of burning incense, frankincense, myrrh, storax, a sweet, holy fog that clings to the lungs. And in the center, various dances. It is not a dance of Rome, of measured steps and martial pride. It is a thing of ecstatic abandon. He spins, a whirlwind of color, his head thrown back, his dark hair flying like a banner. His hands, holding a smoking censer, trace fiery patterns in the air. His voice, high and clear, rises above the din, chanting the god's secret names in a tongue older than Latin, older than Greek. He feels the sun not on his skin, but inside his blood. It is a molten gold, a divine fever that burns away all thought, all self. There is only the god, the rhythm, the heat. He is the conduit, the vessel through which the immense primal power of the sun pours into the world. He is the god's beloved, his instrument, his reflection on earth. Standing in the shadows of a colonnade, watching him, are women of immense power and even greater ambition. His mother, Julia Soaemius, and his grandmother, Julia Maesa. They are of the Severan dynasty, women with royal Syrian blood and Roman political minds as sharp as assassins' blades. They had known power in Rome and had been cast out by the current usurper, the drab prefect Macrinus. Maesa watches her grandson not with a grandmother's affection, but with the calculating eye of a master strategist. She sees the boy, yes, beautiful, strange, lost in his divine trance. But she sees more. She sees a symbol. She sees the fervor of the crowd, the utter devotion in their eyes. These people would die for this boy, for this god. Rome is old and cold, its gods are dead. Its people are hungry for something to believe in. They are tired of grey pragmatists and colorless soldiers on the throne. They crave a mystery, a spectacle, a divine fire to warm their hands by, and Maesa has fire. She has this radiant, otherworldly boy, this living incarnation of the sun. Whispers have already been seeded, carried by merchants and loyal soldiers along the trade routes like desert pollen. Whispers that this boy is not the son of his declared father, but the secret illegitimate child of the beloved, assassinated Emperor Caracalla. A lie, of course, but a beautiful, powerful, useful lie. As Varius spins, his eyes, dark and wide, are open, but see nothing of the temple around him. For a fleeting moment, the sun-drenched courtyard of Emesa dissolves. He sees another city, a city of 7 hills of white stone gone cold. He sees eagles of gold and silver, their wings heavy with dust. He sees a river, sluggish and green, choking on its own history. And then he sees a great procession, his procession, moving through those ghostly streets. He sees the legions of Rome, the most powerful army in the world, kneeling. Not to him, but to the black stone of Emesa, his god which he brings with him. The eagle, the symbol of Jupiter and of Rome itself, bows to the rock. The vision vanishes. He is back in the heat, the smoke, the deafening chant. A drop of sweat, sparkling like a jewel, traces a path from his temple down his cheek. He smiles, a slow, secret smile. The god has shown him a glimpse of his own glory. The world is a stage, and he has just been handed the script. The sun, the true sun in the Syrian sky, blazes at its zenith, a white-hot furnace of unfiltered power. It casts no gentle shadows here. It bleaches the color from the landscape, leaving only blinding light and the sharp, dark lines of what is to come. In Rome, the wan light of evening was beginning to fail, a final, hesitant blush of pale gold on the horizon before the long, cold night. The empire was settling into its twilight, but here in the east the day was far from over. A new light was gathering. It was not the light of reason or order, or the Old Republic. It was a younger, wilder light, a feverish, intoxicating, and terribly dangerous dawn, ready to storm the gates of the West. The shadow of the dancing boy, cast by the midday sun, was unnaturally long, as if it were already stretching all the way to Rome. One afternoon, as Varius practiced the slow, hypnotic dance of the sun ritual in a secluded courtyard, his grandmother watched him from the shade of a colonnade. Gannes, his tutor, a man of sharp intellect and weary patience, stood beside her. "He moves with the god's own grace," Mesa said, her voice low but resonant with satisfaction. It was not a question. Gannes sighed softly, a sound lost in the chirping of unseen birds. "He is a dedicated boy, Domina. He has a rare focus." "It is more than focus, Gannes, it is a communion. The sun god speaks through him. The soldiers returning from the east, they are restless. They tire of this new Emperor Macrinus, this paper pusher who has never commanded a real legion. They long for a sign, for a true heir of the Severan blood." Varius, lost in his movements, was oblivious. His arms rose, tracing the slow arc of the sun across the sky. His face was upturned, his eyes half closed, a look of serene ecstasy upon his features. To him this was not a performance. He could feel the sun on his skin, a warm weight that was both a comfort and a command. He felt its energy flowing into him, a current of liquid gold that made his spirit soar. Was he Varius dancing for the god, or was he the god dancing through Varius? The distinction was a pleasant, hazy blur. "The men of the Third Gallica are garrisoned nearby," Mesa continued, her gaze fixed on the boy. "They were loyal to his cousin, the divine Caracalla. They see the boy, they see the resemblance. It would be a powerful omen, would it not?" Gannes understood perfectly. The boy's uncanny resemblance to the assassinated Emperor Caracalla was no accident of genetics in his grandmother's narrative. It was a divine proclamation. An omen can be a dangerous thing, Domina. It can ignite fires that a child cannot control. Mesa smiled, a thin, knowing curve of her lips. Oh, the child will not have to control it. The god will. The reflections about his own identity came to Varius not as questions, but as feelings. Sometimes, while staring into the polished surface of a golden libation bowl, he would see his own reflection and feel a momentary strangeness, as if looking at a familiar mask worn by someone else. Who was the boy with the dark, serious eyes? He was the servant of Elagabalus. He was the high priest. He was the blood of the Julias. These were his titles, the layers of his being. But underneath it all, a quieter thought sometimes surfaced. He was a wave, and the god was the ocean. When the wave crashed upon the shore, was it still the wave, or had it simply returned to the sea? The thought did not frighten him. It filled him with a sense of profound peace. The rituals grew more elaborate as the whispers grew louder. His grandmother ensured that visiting dignitaries and, more importantly, Roman officers were present for the grand ceremonies. They would watch intrigued as the boy, a jewel of oriental mysticism, danced before the black stone. He would whirl and chant, his high, clear voice echoing in the vast hall, his golden robes a blur of light. He was a spectacle of divine beauty, a stark contrast to the grim, pragmatic world of Roman military politics they inhabited. One morning, the omen his grandmother had been waiting for finally arrived. A cohort of the Third Gallica, led by their centurion, came to the temple to make an offering for victory. They were rough men, their faces tanned to leather by the sun, their armor scarred with the marks of old campaigns. They were cynical, practical, and deeply superstitious. They clumped together awkwardly in the grand hall, their iron-shod sandals scraping on the mosaic floors, looking entirely out of place amidst the incense and gold. Then Varius entered. He was led in by the senior priests, but he seemed to glide rather than walk. He was dressed in his finest regalia, a high, jewel-encrusted headdress catching the morning light that streamed through the clerestory windows, casting a halo around his head. A breastplate of hammered gold depicted the sunburst emblem of his god. He did not look at the soldiers. His gaze was fixed on the altar and the sacred stone beyond it. He began the rites. He moved with the unthinking precision of long practice, but there was an unusual intensity to his movements that day. As he raised the ceremonial dagger, not for blood but to consecrate the air, A stray sunbeam lanced through a high window and struck the polished blade. The light exploded, a blinding flash that shot across the hall and illuminated the faces of the legionaries. The soldiers gasped, shielding their eyes. The centurion, a hardened veteran named Valerius, stared, his mouth agape. When the light subsided, Varius stood with the dagger held aloft, his small form silhouetted against the brilliant altar. For a heartbeat, he did not seem like a boy at all, but like a figure of myth, a mortal vessel channeling an unbearable celestial power. Later in the barracks, the story would be told and retold, each telling more embellished than the last. It was as if the sun itself descended, one legionary would say, his voice hushed with awe. The boy, he did not seem to be of this earth, another would whisper. He has the eyes of the divine Caracalla, the same fire. The whispers had become a roar. The seed of destiny, so carefully planted by Julia Maesa and watered by manufactured omens and genuine awe, had taken root in the fertile ground of military discontent. That evening, as the desert sky turned a deep, bruised purple, Varius sat alone in the sanctum. The day's ceremonies were over. The crowds were gone. It was just him and the stone. The temple was quiet, the only sound the faint, distant call of a night bird. He reached out and laid his palm flat against the beetle. The stone was still warm from the day's sun, a residual heat that felt like a living pulse against his skin. He closed his eyes, feeling the thrum of energy, the silent, ancient power within. He had felt the god's presence during the ceremony. It had been stronger than ever before, a glorious, overwhelming surge of light and power that had filled him until he thought he might burst. He had not created the flash of light from the dagger, but he had felt it coming. He had known, in a way he could not explain, that the sun would greet him at that exact moment. His grandmother had come to him afterwards, her usually stern face soft with a triumphant pride. "The god has shown his favor, my child," she had said, her hand resting on his shoulder. "A great destiny awaits you, a throne not just of a temple but of the world." He did not fully understand what she meant by the world. His world was this temple, this city, this stone. But he understood destiny. Destiny was the sun's path across the sky. It was fixed, glorious, and inevitable. His own path felt the same. He was not choosing it. He was following the light. He was Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was the high priest of Emesa. But as he sat there, feeling the fading warmth of the god beneath his palm, a new name, a new identity, settled over him, as soft and final as the desert night. He was Elagabalus, the mountain, the god, the sun. The distinction was ceasing to matter. The wave was returning to the sea, and the tide he felt with a quiet, certain thrill was about to turn. He was Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was the high priest of Emesa. But as he sat there, feeling the fading warmth of the god beneath his palm, a new name, a new identity, settled over him, as soft and final as the desert night. He was Elagabalus, the mountain, the god, the sun. The distinction was ceasing to matter. The wave was returning to the sea, and the tide he felt with a quiet, certain thrill was about to turn. The story grew warmer, more intimate. It was told around campfires, a secret shared in the dark. It became a truth not because it was proven, but because the soldiers wished it to be true. This beautiful boy, this living god from the temple on the hill, was not just any priest. He was the secret son of their murdered emperor, a divine bastard, theirs to protect, theirs to anoint. Maesa watched the smoke from the campfires rise into the desert night. The pawns were moving on their own now. She had given them a dream, and they were ready to die for it. The night of the proclamation felt like the deepest part of a dream. The air was electric, thick with the smell of torches, sweat, and cheap wine. Maesa and Soaemias, veiled and silent, brought the boy to the edge of the camp. He was dressed not in the wool of a Roman noble, but in the shimmering, gold-threaded silks of his priesthood, a string of pearls in his dark hair. He looked less like a claimant to an empire, and more like an idol brought to life. Gannes, the boy's tutor and Soaemias' lover, a man whose ambition was a whetstone for Maesa's own, stepped forward. His voice boomed across the assembled ranks. He spoke of betrayal, of the low-born Macrinus who dared to sit on a throne meant for gods and their descendants. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he gestured to the boy. "Behold, the blood of Severus, the true son of Antoninus Caracalla. For a heartbeat there was silence. The soldiers stared at the strange, beautiful figure bathed in torchlight. He was an unfamiliar shape, a foreign sigil. Then a single voice roared, "Ave Imperator!" and the silence shattered into 1,000 shards of sound. It was a tidal wave of noise, of fierce, desperate hope. They surged forward. Hands, rough and calloused, reached for the boy. They lifted him, a weightless icon, onto a broad legionary shield. He wobbled, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. A priest suddenly made a god by the will of mortals. As they raised him high, the torchlight caught the gold in his robes, and he blazed like a falling star. Mesa stood back in the shadows, her hands clasped. She felt no joy, only the cold, satisfying click of a complex mechanism locking into place. Check. The game had shifted. The board was now the entire Roman world. The journey to Rome was a slow, surreal procession, a river of gold and steel flowing west. It was less a military campaign and more a pilgrimage. After a brief and farcical battle where Macrinus's forces defected, the path was clear. Word of the boy emperor, the priest-king from the east, traveled faster than their legions. Each morning was a prophecy. As their column marched westward, the sun, the very god the boy served, rose behind them, casting their shadows long before them, pointing the way to Rome. The golden banners they carried, emblazoned not with the Roman eagle, but with the black stone meteor of Elagabalus, seemed to pull the dawn along with them. It felt as if they were not marching toward the sun's destination, but that the sun itself was chasing them, urging them on, anointing their new emperor with every sunrise. Whispers followed them, changing as they crossed from province to province. In Asia Minor, they heard he could command the weather. In Thrace, it was said he did not eat mortal food. In Greece, philosophers debated whether he was a man touched by the divine or a god disguised as a man. The boy, now formerly Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, but known to all by the name of his god Elagabalus, began to believe it himself. He played the part, his public appearances becoming more ritual than address, his pronouncements sounding more like scripture than edict. Soemias was in a state of perpetual religious ecstasy, seeing her son's divinity confirmed with every mile. Mesa, however, remained the calm center of the storm. She managed the logistics, dispatched letters, secured allegiances, and purged enemies. While her daughter and grandson were planning new rituals for their god, Mesa was ensuring the grain supply to Rome would not be interrupted. One could not rule an empire on faith alone. Finally, after more than a year, the hills of Italy rose around them. And then, the city Rome. It did not glitter like the cities of the East. It was vast, ancient, and heavy, a city of stone and lore, of marble and memory. It seemed to absorb the light, its shadows deep with history and skepticism. A delegation of senators and priests of the Roman pantheon came to meet them on the road. They were old men, their faces maps of political intrigue, their togas stark white against the vibrant color of the imperial entourage. They stood in a silent judging line as the procession approached. They saw the Syrian legions, their armor and accents foreign. They saw the golden banners with their strange symbols. They saw Julia Maesa and Julia Soemias, robed and imperious, two women at the heart of power, a deeply unsettling sight for the patriarchal senate. And then they saw the emperor. Elagabalus rode at the head, not in the traditional purple of a Caesar, but in the flowing silk vestments of his priesthood. His face was painted with kohl and rouge, his hands and neck draped in pearls and amulets. He looked ethereal, beautiful, and utterly alien. He was not a general, not a statesman. He was a manifestation. As he passed, the senators and priests bowed, the motion stiff and reluctant. They watched him ride toward the heart of their city, this boy who was to be their ruler, and in their cold, calculating eyes, a new and profound unease began to stir. They sensed that this was not merely a change of emperor, but a change in the very nature of the empire. Something ancient and enigmatic, born of desert sun and ecstatic ritual, had come to claim the throne of the world. They were not watching a boy enter a city. They were watching a god arrive to claim his temple, and they could not yet tell if he had come to save them or to burn it all to the ground. The sea was a sheet of beaten silver under a sun that seemed to hang motionless in the heavens, a white fire reserved for gods and emperors. On the deck of the imperial galley, the air was thick not with the salt of the Mediterranean, but with the scent of myrrh and burning cedar. Here, at the center of a fleet cleaving the waters toward Ostia, rested the god. It was not an idol carved in the familiar image of man or beast. It was a stone, a conical shard of the sky, black and pitted and veined with a fire of its own. It absorbed the light, drinking the day and leaving a palpable coolness in its shadow. This was Elagabal, the unconquered sun, god of Emesa, and its high priest was now the master of Rome. The emperor himself, still known to his house by the name Varius Avitus Bassianus, did not sit upon the gilded throne set for him. He stood before the stone, a boy of 15 years, robed not in the purple of a Caesar, but in the fine silk of a Syrian priest. His eyes, outlined in kohl, never strayed from the sacred form. His lips moved in a silent, ceaseless chant, a prayer learned at his mother's knee in the dusty heat of Emesa. He was a vessel, a conduit for a power far older than the city he was about to claim. Beside him, a study in contrasts, stood his grandmother, Julia Maesa. Her face was a mask of serene composure, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The disciplined sway of the Praetorian guards, the nervous glances of the ship's captain, the unwavering devotion of her grandson. It was she who had orchestrated this, who had seen in the boy's holy fervor the perfect instrument to restore her family to the throne. She had woven a legend of a divine birth, whispered it into the ears of discontented legions, and paid for their loyalty in gold. Now she watched the final, most audacious piece of her plans sail toward its destination. The boy had won the empire. His god must now conquer its soul. His mother, Julia Soaemias, watched him with a simpler, purer adoration. For her this was not politics but destiny fulfilled. Her son, the priest-king, was bringing enlightenment to the shadowed heart of the world. And watching them all with a quiet paternal concern was Gannes, the boy's tutor. He had taught the young emperor rhetoric and law, but had long since understood that his pupil's true language was that of incense and ritual. As the coastline of Italy rose from the horizon, a low rhythmic drumming began, joined by the high thin wail of flutes. It was not the sound of a Roman triumph, not the blare of brass horns and the tramp of marching feet. It was the music of the desert, of ancient rites performed under a canopy of stars, and it was the first true taste of the East that Rome would be forced to swallow. The Palatine Hill had always been the heart of Rome's power. It was a place of memory and marble, where the ghosts of Augustus and Tiberius walked the columned porticos of their palaces. Its temples were monuments to order, to the grave and stoic gods who had guided the Republic and consecrated the empire. The Temple of Jupiter, Victor, and the Temple of Apollo Palatinus were studies in white stone and straight lines, their altars cold except on days of prescribed state ceremony. Into this world of rigid piety, the construction of the Elagabalium came as a wound. Work began on the northeastern slope, a terrace overlooking the Colosseum and the Forum itself. The emperor commanded it, and the wealth of the treasury made it so. But it rose differently. Where Roman temples were built to be admired from the outside, this one was designed to draw life inward. Its walls were not of stark Pentelic marble, but of a warmer, sand-colored stone inlaid with polished black basalt that seemed to drink the Italian sunlight. Artisans, brought from Antioch and Damascus, carved friezes not of disciplined legions or solemn senatorial processions, but of ecstatic dancers, of priests with arms upraised to a blazing sun, of eagles carrying sacred stones to the heavens. Cedar wood from Lebanon, its fragrance a constant exotic perfume hanging over the hill, was used for the ceilings and doors. Bronze gates, gilded to a blinding brilliance, were forged to face the east, so the first rays of the rising sun would strike them and flood the inner sanctum with light. The senators watched from below, their faces impassive. They saw the old foundations of a shrine to Orcus, a god of the underworld, torn up to make way for this foreign light. They saw storerooms of imperial palaces requisitioned, their layouts altered to serve the new temple's complex of courtyards and ritual chambers. They whispered amongst themselves in the cool halls of the Curia. They spoke of sacrilege, of a boy emperor who did not understand the mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors. They spoke of the foundation of Rome itself, of Romulus reading the auspices on this very hill. Now that sacred soil was being disturbed for a deity that was little more than a meteorite, a lump of rock from a province they barely deigned to notice. The priests of the Roman cults trembled. The Pontifex Maximus, his authority now a hollow shell, was invited daily to observe the temple's progress. He stood in his traditional white toga, a figure of archaic purity against the vibrant, almost chaotic energy of the construction site. He watched as vast quantities of gold and silver were carted up the hill, not to be stored as treasure, but to be melted down for altar furnishings and statues of Syrian gods. He heard the unfamiliar Syrian tongue of the foreman overriding the Latin of the Roman engineers. He saw the place being prepared for a god who demanded not quiet reverence, but wild, passionate worship, and he felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was not a new god joining the pantheon, as so many had before. This was a replacement. When the temple was consecrated, Rome held its breath. The Elagabalus was finished, a golden wound on the Palatine. An invitation, which was a command, was sent to the Senate and the priestly colleges. They were to witness the installation of the god. The procession snaked its way through the Forum and up the Clivus Palatinus. It was a spectacle of overwhelming sensation. The air, already thick with the smoke of 1,000 censers swinging in unison, was made heavier by the scent of flowers strewn before the path. At the head of the procession, walking backward so as to never turn his back on his god, was the Emperor Elagabalus. He was a vision of alien splendor. His robes were purple silk, heavy with gold thread and seed pearls. On his head was not a laurel wreath, but a towering jeweled tiara. His face was painted, his cheeks rouged, his eyes dark and hypnotic. Behind him, on a chariot drawn by 6 perfectly white horses, came the black stone of Emesa. It was set in a bed of gold, surrounded by the most sacred relics of the empire, which Elagabalus had ordered, removed from their own sanctuaries. The Palladium, the sacred shield of Mars, even the flame of Vesta was said to have been transferred, all brought to serve as attendants to this new, supreme deity. The music was a constant, pulsing rhythm of drums and the shaking of sistrums, punctuated by the high ululating cries of eunuch priests. It was a sound that unsettled the Roman soul. Accustomed to the solemnity of its own hymns, they entered the temple courtyard. Before the great eastern doors stood a massive altar. As the senators and priests of Rome stood stiffly along the porticos, their faces pale masks of disbelief, the ritual began. Elagabalus moved to the altar. There was no Roman gravity in his movements, none of the measured steps of the pontifex. He began to dance. It was a slow, sinuous turning at first, his arms weaving patterns in the thick air. As the music quickened, his movements grew more frenetic, a dance of pure, ecstatic communion. He was not an emperor performing a rite. He was a priest possessed by his god. He sang in his native tongue, a high, piercing chant that spoke of the sun's journey, of creation and destruction, of life born from celestial fire. Wine was poured onto the altar, mingling with the blood of sacrificed sheep and oxen, their numbers staggering, a hecatomb meant to display the boundless power and appetite of the new god. The smoke from the offerings rose in a dense, greasy column, carrying the smell of roasting meat and spices across the city, a scent both intoxicating and sickening. Julia Maesa stood near the entrance, her expression unreadable. She tallied the faces in the crowd, noting the fear in the eyes of the priests of Jupiter, the barely veiled contempt on the faces of the older senators. This was the cost. She only hoped the benefit, a dynasty secured by a god of its own making, would be worth the price. The sun began to set, casting long, stark shadows across the city. The last of the sacrifices had been made. The crowd, stunned into a silent awe, had dispersed. The senators had retreated to their villas to whisper, and the priests to their temples to pray for the soul of Rome. The Elagabalus grew quiet. Inside the sanctum, the only light came from 100 hanging oil lamps, their flames reflecting like captured stars on the polished marble floor and the golden ceiling. The air was still heavy with the day's incense, a sacred fog that softened every edge. Elagabalus stood alone before the black stone. He had shed his imperial regalia and wore a simple, unadorned white tunic. The paint had been wiped from his face, leaving only the dark stain of coal around his eyes, which seemed impossibly large in the dim light. He was just a boy again, slender and weary from the day's ecstatic exertions. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the surface of the stone. It was not cold like the marble of Jupiter's altar. It was warm, humming with a deep internal life, a latent heat from its journey through the cosmos. He felt the vibration of it travel up his arm, a current of silent power that centered him, that affirmed everything he was. Here, in the heart of his new empire, he had given his god a home. But it was not enough. To be housed among other gods was to be merely one of them. His god was not one, it was the one. He leaned his forehead against the stone, the whispers of his ancestors and the chants of Emesa echoing in his mind. He was the bridge between them, the hand that would join east and west under a single divine light. His voice, when he spoke, was not the high-pitched chant of the priest, nor the commanding tone of an emperor. It was a low, solemn whisper, a vow made not to men but to the universe itself, spoken into the heart of the stone. "They do not understand," he murmured, his breath fogging on the dark surface. "But they will. Jupiter will bow, the Capitoline Triad will be your servants. Mars will kneel, all gods, Roman and foreign, will be but reflections of your singular glory. Here in this heart, on this hill, only the sun will reign." He closed his eyes, feeling the stone's ancient warmth answer his vow. Outside, the last sliver of the old sun disappeared behind the Janiculum hill, and for the first time, Rome was left to the darkness under the watch of a new and jealous god. The Roman sun beat down on the Palatine hill, its glare a constant oppressive presence. But within the cool shadowed confines of the imperial palaces, a different kind of heat simmered, the restless yearning heat of a young emperor's heart. Elagabalus, barely old enough to shave, found the weight of his title a heavy cloak, often more confining than comforting. His true self, a kaleidoscope of desires and fascinations, felt perpetually out of step with the rigid pronouncements of Roman law and tradition. He walked through moonlit corridors, the marble floors cool beneath his sandaled feet. The silence was often broken only by the echo of his own footsteps, a lonely counterpoint to the grand pronouncements of state he was expected to make. In these quiet hours, far from the clamoring crowds and the scrutinizing eyes of the Senate, Elagabalus wrestled with himself. He was the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, a divine emissary, yet he felt profoundly, achingly human. His fascination with beauty was a consuming fire. It wasn't confined to the celebrated, the statuesque perfection of marble gods, or the sculpted forms of favored courtiers. It bloomed in 1,000 forms, the iridescent sheen of a beetle's wing, the delicate blush of a ripening peach, the intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine. He found beauty in the unlikeliest of places, in the rough hands of a stable boy, in the raw power of a gladiator's physique, in the soft curves of a woman's smile. And in these moments of aesthetic rapture, the boundaries of his world, the carefully constructed walls of rank and expectation, seemed to dissolve. His tutors, his formidable grandmother Julia Maesa and his mother Julia Soemius, spoke of duty, of lineage, of the needs of the empire. They saw his passions as distractions, as potential liabilities. But for Elagabalus, these passions were the very essence of his being, the vibrant threads that wove the tapestry of his soul. He yearned for an authentic connection, a love that transcended the artificialities of his position. His early marriages were, by Roman standards, conventional enough. There was Julia Cornelia, a woman of noble lineage, chosen perhaps more for her name than for any spark between them. The ceremony itself was a blur of ritual and obligation, a performance for the benefit of the state. He respected her, he supposed, but the deep resonant chord he sought, the echo of his own soul in another, remained stubbornly silent. The same was true for the second, Julia Aquilia. He recalled the scent of her oils, the rustle of her stola, the courteous nods of her family. But the intimacy he craved remained elusive, a phantom limb he constantly felt but could never grasp. He remembered one stifling afternoon during a feast meant to celebrate a minor military triumph. The wine flowed, the music played, but Elagabalus found himself watching Gannes, his Syrian eunuch and trusted caregiver, his tutor in the ways of pleasure and refinement. Gannes, with his graceful movements and his subtly alluring presence, could evoke a sense of peace and understanding that no senator or matron ever could. It was a connection, a warmth that eluded him in the more formal spheres of his life. He felt a gentle ache in his chest when he looked at Gannes, a longing for something he couldn't quite articulate, something that felt both natural and, he sensed, perhaps a little too close to the forbidden. Then came Aquilia Severa. The name itself held a certain gravity, a whispered reverence. She was a Vestal Virgin, a priestess sworn to chastity, an embodiment of Rome's sacred traditions. The whispers that rippled through the palace when Elagabalus announced his intention to marry her were not of scandal, but of bewilderment, of disbelief. But for Elagabalus, it was not about defiance, not entirely. It was about a profound, almost spiritual attraction. Aquilia Severa possessed a quiet radiance, a serene beauty that spoke of an inner strength, an untouched grace. He saw in her not just a woman, but a living symbol, an embodiment of purity. And in his own confused heart he felt a potent draw. He saw a way to bridge the chasm between his divine aspirations and his earthly desires. If he, the living God, could unite with the sacred Vestal, would that not be the ultimate testament to his divinity? He recalled the day he first saw her clearly, not as an untouchable icon, but as a woman in the flesh. She had been attending a religious ceremony, her white robe stark against the vibrant colors of the imperial retinue. Her gaze, when it met his, was steady, unblinking, yet held a flicker of something he couldn't decipher. Curiosity, perhaps, or a deep, knowing sadness. He felt a tremor, a resonance that his other unions had never stirred. The union with Aquilia Severa was a radical departure, a blurring of lines that sent shockwaves through Roman society. He invited the gods themselves to witness their union. He described their union as a sacred rite, a marriage between the god Elagabal and the goddess. He saw himself as a conduit, channeling divine will through his personal life. He was both the emperor and a devotee, the lover and the beloved of the divine. Yet even amidst these grand pronouncements and the fervor of his devotion, a quiet loneliness persisted. He would wander the palace gardens at night, the scent of roses heavy in the air, constellations scattered like diamond dust above. He would trace the patterns of moonlight on ancient columns, his thoughts turning inward. Was he truly a god, or merely a boy playing at godhood, desperately seeking an anchor in a world that demanded too much of him? He would look at his reflection in the polished bronze mirrors, searching for the face of divinity, and see only the anxious eyes of a young man. He loved the rituals, the incense, the chanting, the feeling of being connected to something vast and ancient. But the human heart, with its messy, complicated needs, was a different kind of altar. He remembered a private moment with his mother, Julia Soemius. She, more than anyone, understood his unconventional spirit, his longing for something beyond the ordinary. She had watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. "My son," she had said, her voice soft, "the gods are not meant to be loved as mortals love. They are to be revered, to be feared. But how could he revere what he didn't understand? How could he fear what drew him so powerfully, so inexplicably? He saw divinity not as a distant, unapproachable force, but as something vibrant, alive, something that could be touched, embraced. He had brought his Syrian gods to Rome, seeking to elevate them, to merge them with the Roman pantheon. He saw their worship as a personal quest, a way to infuse his life with the spiritual fervor he craved. His devotion to the sun god Elagabal was absolute, a consuming passion. He believed himself to be Elagabal's earthly representative, and in this conviction, he felt a strange and potent sense of destiny. But the world, with its pragmatic concerns and its unwavering adherence to tradition, was not ready for his vision. The senators muttered, the priests cautioned, and the people, though often swayed by spectacle, held a deep-seated respect for the old ways. He was torn. One moment, he was draped in the ceremonial robes of his priesthood, performing sacred rites with unwavering conviction. The next, he was seeking solace in the quiet company of those who understood his desires, who saw beyond the imperial facade. He found himself drawn to men as well as women, his affections untethered by the strictures of Roman society. He confused the ardor of religious devotion with the intensity of romantic love, seeing divinity in the beauty of the human form, in the sincerity of a shared glance. He remembered a particularly poignant moment, standing on a balcony overlooking the city, the night air cool and fragrant. Rome lay spread out before him, a sea of twinkling lights, a monument to human ambition. He felt the weight of its history, its power, and the profound solitude of being its ruler. He was an emperor, a god, and yet in that moment he felt like a lost child. He had tried to capture the essence of his desires, to give them form and meaning. He had bestowed titles upon his favored companions, elevating them in ways that defied convention. He saw their beauty, their presence as divine gifts, and his affections for them as reflections of a god's boundless generosity. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of imperial duties and private contemplation, he found himself in his private chambers. The doors were closed, the servants dismissed. The only light came from a few strategically placed oil lamps, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. He was alone, truly alone. He thought of Aquilia Severa, her serene beauty and the enigma that surrounded her. He thought of Ganes, his warmth and the quiet understanding in his eyes. He thought of the vast indifferent sky above. A profound weariness settled over him, a weariness of the world, of his own conflicted heart. He was Elagabalus, the emperor, the high priest, the living god. But who was Elagabalus, the man? He was a question mark, a whisper in the vast expanse of imperial power. He walked to a window, tracing the cool glass with his fingertip. The moon, a pale sentinel, hung in the inky sky. He was a creature of myth, of legend, a figure destined to be dissected and debated for centuries. But in this solitary moment, he was simply a soul grappling with the most fundamental of human needs. He whispered into the darkness, the words barely audible, catching on the stillness of the air. Can a god be loved? The question hung there unanswered, a melancholic echo in the vast chambers of his solitary heart. The night in the Palatine breathed silk. Not the crisp martial silk of a legionary standard, but the soft sighing silk of Syrian looms, dyed in Tyrian purple and saffron yellow. It clung to couches, draped from gilded ceilings, and whispered against the bare arms of senators who had long forgotten the feel of honest wool. The air itself was a tapestry, woven from the competing scents of spikenard, roasting dormice, and the dizzying funereal sweetness of 1,000 roses. At the heart of this perfumed chaos sat the emperor, Varius Avitus Bassianus, known to the grumbling city as Elagabalus. He was not yet 17. A boy god, a priest-king, enthroned in a chamber designed to be a miniature heaven on earth. His face, exquisitely painted in the Eastern fashion, was a placid mask of divine indifference. But his eyes, dark and restless, missed nothing. They darted from the anxious smiles of the consuls to the shimmering undulations of the dancers, forever searching for a flicker of genuine feeling in the shimmering artifice. Tonight's theme was color. Each course of the feast adhered to a strict palette. First came the cerulean dishes, peacock tongues arranged like lapis lazuli tiles, fish glazed with a sauce of crushed hyacinth, wine tinted a startling sky blue. The senators, men accustomed to the earthy tones of roast boar and red wine, poked at the food with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They ate because not to eat was to invite a glance from the divine emperor, and such glances had a way of preceding unfortunate accidents. Elagabalus watched them, a small, secret smile playing on his lips. He clapped his hands, a sound as sharp and final as a closing lock. From the gallery above, musicians struck up a tune on zithers and pipes, a melody that coiled and twisted like the snakes of his native Emesa. It was a sound utterly alien to Roman ears, full of discordant notes and sudden ecstatic bursts. It made the old patricians shift uncomfortably on their silken cushions. They preferred the steady, predictable march of a military brass band. This was chaotic, lyrical, foreign. He leaned towards his tutor, the ever-present, ever-weary Ganes. "They do not appreciate true harmony, do they, Ganes?" he murmured, his voice soft, almost feminine. Ganes, a man whose pragmatism was a rock in this sea of decadence, inclined his head. His expression was carefully neutral. "They are Romans, Dominus. Their souls march to the beat of a drum, not the sigh of a flute. Then we must teach them to dance," Elagabalus said, his eyes gleaming. He made a subtle gesture. High above, hidden nets stirred. The senators, lulled by the blue wine and the strange music, noticed nothing until the first petals began to fall. They drifted down like soft pink snow, rose petals by the thousands. A light, fragrant shower that drew murmurs of appreciation. What a delightful fancy. The emperor was a poet, but the shower became a flurry, then a torrent. Petals cascaded from the ceiling in thick, suffocating drifts. They piled on shoulders, filled wine goblets, and carpeted the floor. Laughter turned to nervous coughs as the air grew thick with perfume. Soon the heaps of petals were ankle-deep, then knee-deep. A distinguished ex-consul, Attempting to stand, found himself mired in a fragrant bog. He flailed, his purple-striped toga vanishing into the pink deluge. From his elevated couch, Elagabalus watched with rapt attention. This was his art, a beautiful, ridiculous, overwhelming spectacle. He had imagined their gasps of wonder, their joyous submission to the sheer beauty of it all. He had wanted to drown them in loveliness. But now, peering through the storm of flowers, he saw not joy but panic. Their faces were masks of strained politeness, crumbling into genuine fear. The fun was draining out of it. The silence he was trying to fill was only growing louder, echoing in the space between the desperate smiles and his own hollow amusement. He gestured again, irritably this time, and the floral avalanche ceased. Servants rushed in to help the senators dig themselves out, their dignity in tatters, their hair and beards dusted with pink. In a corner of the room, 2 women watched. His mother, Julia Suemius, wore a look of indulgent exasperation, as if her child had merely overturned a jar of honey. But his grandmother, the formidable Julia Maesa, the architect of his reign, was not smiling. Her eyes, sharp and cold as obsidian chips, were fixed on her grandson. Her silence was a judgment, a constant chilling reminder that this entire glittering charade served a purpose: power. And he, the divine priest of the sun god Elagabal, was merely her most valuable and most volatile instrument. The next course was announced, the vermilion course. Lobsters boiled to a fiery red, flamingo brains in a pool of blood-orange sauce, and wine from fountains that spouted deep claret streams into silver basins. The guests approached the fountains hesitantly, as if expecting them to dispense hemlock. Elagabalus decided a game was in order. "A lottery," he declared, his voice ringing with forced cheer. Slaves circulated with tablets. The senators wrote their names, their hands still trembling slightly. The prizes Elagabalus announced were magnificent. One elderly senator, a man whose family traced its lineage back to the Republic, won 10 pounds of gold. He nearly wept with relief. The man next to him, a sycophant who had delivered a groveling speech earlier, won a single mouldering grape. Another won a chariot inlaid with ivory. His neighbor won a lead comb. Diapreta, known for his pomposity, unrolled his token to discover he was the proud new owner of a dead mouse. Elagabalus laughed, a high, clear sound that did not quite reach his eyes. He loved the arbitrariness of it, the divine caprice. He was fortune, he was fate. He held their dignity in his hands and could crush it or gild it as he pleased. Yet their reactions were all the same. The winners prostrated themselves with gratitude. The losers forced smiles of good sportsmanship. It was all performance. No one was real. Was he the only real person in the room? He felt a deep, aching weariness settle over him. He had filled the room with every sensation imaginable. Sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. He had poured all the wealth of the empire onto this floor tonight. And for what? To be surrounded by these whispering puppets, these hollow men whose fear smelled sharper than the spikenard. He needed something true, something primal. With another flick of his wrist, he gave the final signal. From concealed baskets near the walls, servants released a collection of snakes. Not vipers or asps. He was not a monster, merely an artist. But common, harmless grass snakes. They slithered across the marble floors, their green and yellow scales iridescent in the lamplight. The effect was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. The last vestiges of Roman stoicism shattered. Senators yelped and leapt onto couches. A man of immense girth and gravity tried to climb a column. The carefully constructed symphony of the evening dissolved into a cacophony of shrieks. For the first time all night, the faces around him were alight with genuine, unadulterated emotion. It was terror, yes, but it was real. Elagabalus finally leaned back, a genuine beatific smile gracing his lips. He watched the chaos as a painter watches his colors mix upon the canvas. His mother was laughing now, a helpless tinkling sound. Even Ganys cracked a weary smile. Only Maesa remained impassive, her gaze a cold anchor in the swirling storm of panic. She saw not a prank, but a political miscalculation. One does not frighten the men who command legions and control the grain supply, but Elagabalus did not care. For a fleeting moment, the roaring silence in his soul was drowned out by the screams of his guests. He felt a surge of power that was purer than any decree, more absolute than any title. It was the power to unmake order, to impose his own beautiful, terrifying reality upon the world. He was not just an emperor, he was a god, and this was his ceremony. Eventually the guests fled. They did not wait to be dismissed. They scrambled from the room, tripping over rose petals and overturned goblets, leaving a wake of discarded dignity. The great hall, moments before a theater of sensation, fell quiet. The only sounds were the rustle of the remaining snakes exploring their new domain, and the distant, methodical clatter of servants beginning to clear the devastation. Julia Soemias approached, dabbing at her eyes. "Oh, my divine son." You must admit the look on Senator Gracchus's face. "Leave me," Elagabalus said, his voice flat. The elation had evaporated as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a bitter residue. His mother's smile faltered. She glanced at Mesa, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "As you wish, Augustus," Soemias said, bowing. Mesa lingered a moment longer. "'Tis an expensive night," she said, her voice dry as dust. "And you have purchased nothing but ill will." "I am the sun," Elagabalus replied, not looking at her. "I do not purchase, I shine. Whether they enjoy the light or are blinded by it is their concern, not mine." She left him then, a pillar of disapproving silk vanishing into the shadows. Gannes was the last to go. "You should rest, Dominus." Elagabalus waved a dismissive hand. The sun does not rest alone. He was finally alone. The silence he had fought so hard to banish now rushed back in, a physical presence. It was colder and heavier than before. He slid from his couch, his bare feet sinking into the damp, crushed roses. The floor was sticky with spilled wine. The air, once a heady perfume, now smelled of decay. He walked through the wreckage of his heaven. A half-eaten flamingo brain lay on the floor, looking like a pale, sad jewel. A silver goblet had been crushed under a fleeing foot. He picked up one of the harmless snakes, letting it coil around his arm. Its dry scales were cool against his skin. It was simple. It wanted nothing from him. He wandered to the great open archway that looked out over the city. The noise of the feast had hidden the fact that the night had passed. A faint, pearlescent grey was beginning to dilute the eastern sky. Dawn was coming. His dawn, the dawn of the unconquered sun. Below him, in the courtyard, stood the gilded statues he had brought from Emesa, statues of his attendant gods, their faces serene and implacable. As the first rays of the true sun broke over the Alban hills, the light struck the statues. It slid like honey over their golden limbs, setting them ablaze. For a moment they seemed to live, to breathe a light that was far purer than the flickering lamplight of his banquet hall. Elagabalus sat on the cold marble steps, the snake still wrapped around his arm. He watched the light crawl across the silent golden faces. He, the Emperor of Rome, the living god on earth, had filled his palace with every pleasure, every treasure, every wonder the world could offer. He had commanded laughter and feasted on fear. And now in the clean, quiet light of his own sun, he felt nothing at all. The statues were beautiful, but they were just gold. The silence was absolute. And in the vast, echoing emptiness of his own grandeur, the boy emperor sat utterly, divinely, alone, waiting for a day that would feel exactly like the night before. The silence in Rome had become a language of its own. It was not the reverent hush of a temple, but the coiled stillness of a serpent before it strikes. It was a silence that filled the spaces between the clatter of chariot wheels on stone, the murmur of the marketplace, and the clang of a legionary's gladius against his armor. It was the sound of an empire holding its breath. At the heart of this silence stood the emperor, Varius Avitus Bassianus, though he insisted on the name of his god, Elagabalus. Today, he was marrying that god, or rather, he was facilitating the marriage of his god, the conical black stone of Emesa, to Pallas Athena. To the Romans, it was Minerva. To the senators watching from their shaded palanquins, it was sacrilege wrapped in farce. The procession moved through streets dusted with gold powder. Elagabalus, a slender youth of 16, was a riot of color against the austere marble of the Forum. He wore robes of Tyrian purple silk, so heavily embroidered with gold thread that they seemed to move with a life of their own. His eyes, lined with kohl in the Syrian fashion, were fixed on the sky, searching for an omen in the flight of a common sparrow. He held the reins of 6 immaculate white horses. walking backward before the god's chariot, so that he might never turn his back on the divine. It was, from a practical standpoint, a deeply inefficient way to travel. Senator Lucius Marius Maximus, a man whose family had seen the Republic fall and the Empire rise, watched from the steps of the Curia. His face was a mask of patrician control, but his hands were clenched so tightly around a scroll that his knuckles were bone-white. The anger in the Senate was a low, simmering heat. It was not the fiery rage of open rebellion, but the corrosive resentment of men of tradition, forced to witness their world being dismantled by a boy priest. They had stomached mad emperors, cruel emperors, and incompetent emperors. But an absurd emperor, that was a wound to their dignity, the one currency a senator truly valued. "He weds a rock to a statue," a nearby senator whispered, his voice dry as dust. "Caesar conquered Gaul. Augustus gave us peace. Trajan expanded our borders. This one, he plans divine nuptials." Lucius Marius did not turn. "The gods of Rome are patient," he murmured, his words a cold comfort. "But their patience has limits." Further down the Via Sacra, near the Arch of Titus, stood the generals. Their disgust was a more tangible thing. It was in the set of their jaws, the rigid line of their shoulders. General Claudius Argento, a veteran of the Dacian Wars whose face was a roadmap of old scars, watched the emperor stumble slightly, catching himself before he fell over his own silken hems. Argento's lip curled. He and his men were soldiers of Mars, of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. They understood the logic of shield and spear, the brutal arithmetic of a pitched battle. They did not understand this. They had been ordered to have their legion's eagles dip in reverence as the black stone passed, not to the emperor but to the stone. Argento had given the order, his voice tight with a shame that felt like swallowing bile. His men had obeyed, their movements stiff, their eyes turned away. They saw a Syrian priest, not a commander-in-chief. They saw weakness draped in finery, a strange effeminate ritual where a show of strength should be. The legions on the Rhine and the Danube faced barbarian hordes. Their emperor was busy with celestial matchmaking. The disgust of the generals was the disgust of professionals watching an amateur dismantle the finest machine ever built. Elagabalus, oblivious, smiled. The sun, his son, felt warm on his face. He felt the power of his god flowing through him, a heady, intoxicating wine. The silence of the crowd was awe, he decided. The stiff formality of the senators was respect. The grim faces of the soldiers were a sign of their solemn devotion. They see, he thought, his inner voice a whisper of reassurance. They see the light of Emesa brought to this city of shadows. I am the vessel. The unconquered sun shines through me, but then a flicker, a cold draught in the warm sun of his certainty. Or am I just a boy from a distant province dressed in a dead emperor's clothes? Did they make me a god, or did they simply hand me a leash, cursed or chosen? Sometimes in the quiet of the temple, they feel like the same thing. He shook the thought away as a fly. Doubt was a shadow. He was the sun. That evening, in the sprawling gardens of the Palatine, his grandmother, Julia Maesa, found him. She was the true architect of his reign, a woman whose ambition was forged from imperial steel. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "The Senate is displeased," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "They find your devotions alien." "Rome is alien," Elagabalus replied, not looking at her. He was arranging pomegranate seeds on a silver platter, a form of divination. "It needs to be purified by the light of Elagabal. It needs to be governed," Maesa countered, her tone sharp. "A god needs worshippers, grandson. You are frightening them away. They whisper that you command senators to attend your rites, that you have defiled the temple of Vesta. I have not defiled it. I have elevated it. The sacred fire of Vesta will now be attendant to the true flame of the sun." His mother, Julia Soemius, entered the room, her movements a graceful glide. She placed a reassuring hand on her son's shoulder. "Pay them no mind, my divine son. Rome has always resisted new light. They resisted Caesar. They will learn to worship you just as we do." She smiled, her adoration absolute and in its own way more dangerous than Maesa's pragmatism. Later, Gannes came to him, the loyal tutor, the brilliant commander who had placed Elagabalus on the throne. now looked old and tired. His loyalty was warring with his Roman sense of propriety. "Majesty," Gannys began, his voice heavy, "the Praetorians, they are uneasy." The Praetorian Guard, the Emperor's personal legion, the kingmakers and kingbreakers of Rome. Their barracks were a city within a city, a nest of power and paranoia. "Uneasy?" Elagabalus asked, genuinely puzzled. "I have doubled their pay." "It is not about coin, Majesty," Gannys said, choosing his words with immense care. "They are soldiers. They swore an oath to the gods of Rome as much as to the Emperor. When you commanded a detachment to dance during the Festival of the Sun, they obeyed. But they were shamed. It was a dance of celestial alignment," Elagabalus exclaimed, his voice rising. "A warrior's prayer." "To them," Gannys said softly, "it was not. They fear the old gods are angered. They fear this invites chaos. An empire is held together by shared beliefs, Majesty, by tradition. Your action, they are sawing at the pillars." Elagabalus turned away, his jaw set. "You sound like my grandmother. You have all forgotten. I was chosen. The omens were clear. The god resides in me. I am not sawing at pillars. I am building a temple grander than any you have ever known." The fear among the Praetorians was different from the senator's anger or the general's disgust. It was a primal, superstitious fear. They were simple men, for the most part, recruited from the provinces. They understood loyalty, pay, and the anger of the gods. They were now forced to guard an emperor who seemed determined to provoke the latter, while taking the former for granted. They saw him conduct rites with mysterious eunuchs from the east. They heard strange chanting music from the palace at night. They watched as the most sacred relics of Rome were carted off to the temple of his foreign god. Their fear was the fear of men who believe the roof is about to collapse on their heads, and they are the ones tasked with holding it up. That night, Elagabalus slept poorly. He dreamt of the black stone, but instead of pulsing with light, it was cold and inert. He dreamt he was walking backward forever, the city of Rome receding into an endless distance. He awoke in a sweat, the silken sheets clinging to his skin. Cursed, the whisper came again in the dark. Just a boy in a gilded cage. He rose and went to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. The stars, usually a brilliant canopy over the 7 hills, were obscured by a thick, unnatural haze, a sky without stars, an empty heaven. He did not know that less than a mile away, in the torchlit shadows of the Castra Praetoria, the whispers had finally begun to take shape. They were quiet, passed from man to man over cups of sour wine spoken in the darkness of the barracks. "He makes a mockery of us, of the Empire. The old guards are watching. They will not stand for it." Gannys tries to restrain him, but his mother and the others, they encourage the madness. A centurion, a man named Decimus, spat on the earthen floor. An emperor should lead legions, not dances. Then another voice, lower than the rest, full of consequence. "There is another option. The grandmother, Mesa, she is a pragmatist. And the boy's cousin, Severus Alexander. He is a Roman. He is quiet, respectful." The name hung in the air, a spark in a storeroom full of dry tinder. No one spoke for a long moment. There was no need. The thought had been planted. The path had been illuminated, not by the light of a Syrian sun god, but by the cold, practical glow of self-preservation. Under a sky without stars, the thunder that had been a distant rumble for months was finally gathering overhead. The serpent of Rome, so long silent, was beginning to uncoil. The sun over the Palatine was the color of old honey, thick and warm, spilling over the cypress trees and staining the marble walls. On such a day it was difficult to believe in endings. For the boy who was an emperor, and an emperor who was a god, it felt as though the afternoon might stretch into a golden eternity. Varius Avitus Bassianus, whom the world called Elagabalus, was 17. He sat not on a throne but on a silk cushion in a walled garden, the air heavy with the scent of crushed petals and Syrian nard. He was tracing the patterns on a damask robe, the threads of silver and gold cool beneath his fingertips. The world for him had always been a thing of texture and scent, of the resonant hum of a sistrum and the taste of wine cooled with snow from the mountains. The business of empire, the tedious ledgers, the grim-faced senators, the endless petitions was a distant noise, a dull grey sea that broke against the shores of his vibrant, perfumed island. He thought of Ganys, his tutor, his protector. He thought of his sharp intelligence and his sudden, brutal absence. His grandmother, Julia Miser, had seen to that. Maisa, the true foundation of their Severan dynasty, was a creature of granite and iron will, and she had begun to look at her grandson, the priest of Elagabal, with the cool, appraising eye of a mason inspecting a stone that has cracked. The whispers had told him so. The whispers said she now favored his cousin, the quiet, pliable Alexander. A discordant sound broke the afternoon's languor. It was not the familiar clang of a guard's spear against a shield, nor the call of a trumpet. It was a shout, distant but sharp, from the direction of the Castra Praetoria. It was a raw, hungry sound, the noise of a pack that has caught a scent. Elagabalus looked up from the silver threads. The honeyed light seemed to thin, to grow pale. The garden, a moment before a sanctuary, now felt like a cage of clipped hedges and silent statues. Another shout followed, closer this time, and it was answered by 1,000 voices, a guttural roar that rolled up the hill and shivered through the marble beneath him. It was the sound of a promise being broken, the promise of loyalty, of security, of life. The door to the garden crashed open. It was his mother, Julia Soamius. Her carefully arranged hair was escaping its pearl-strewn nets, and her face, usually a placid mask of imperial contentment, was stark with a terror that hollowed her eyes. She did not speak his title. "Various," she breathed, her voice a ragged thread. She seized his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. The silk of his sleeve wrinkled under her fingers. "We must go, now." He allowed himself to be pulled to his feet, a puppet whose strings had just been jerked taut. The roaring was a constant presence now, a wave of sound that seemed to be eroding the very foundations of the palace. As they stepped from the garden into the long colonnaded hallway, the sound gained a new texture, the rhythmic percussive slam of thousands of hobnailed sandals on stone. It was a sound that had once thrilled him during parades. Now it was the beat of a monstrous heart, and it was coming for him. They began to run. Their flight was a strange, silent ballet through a world of echoing grandeur. They passed through the throne room, where the empty chair of state sat beneath a canopy of Tyrian purple, a silent rebuke to the boy fleeing past it. They hurried through vast atriums where sunlight streamed down from oculi high above, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like frantic golden spirits. The mosaics beneath their feet depicted the triumphs of Augustus, the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, gods and heroes locked in eternal silent struggle. Elagabalus's sandaled feet slipped on the serene face of Jupiter. The sounds were multiplying. A heavy bronze door at the far end of the palace splintered with a deafening crack, the noise echoing down the long corridors like a thunderclap. It was followed by the crash of breaking pottery, the high crystalline shriek of a priceless porphyry vase, a gift from an Egyptian prefect shattering against a marble floor. The shouts were clearer now, no longer a formless roar but distinct angry words. Names were being called, his name, his mother's name. Julia Soamius pulled him down a narrower passage, a service corridor smelling of olive oil and damp stone. Her breath came in sharp, painful gasps. She kept looking back, not at their pursuers, who were still just a sound, but at her son's face as if to memorize it. Her love for him, so often a cloying, indulgent thing, had been distilled by fear into its purest form. A fierce, desperate shield. They were in a part of the palace he rarely saw, a labyrinth of storerooms and servants' quarters. Here the marble gave way to plain plaster, the mosaics to beaten earth. The sound of the hunt was all around them now, a tightening net of noise. They could hear the heavy footfalls in the grander halls they had just fled, the sound of soldiers spreading out, methodical and certain. They found a small, dark room at the end of a passage, a latrine, its air thick and close. His mother pushed him inside, her hands trembling on his shoulders. There was nowhere else to go. This was the end of the line, the final ignominious hiding place for a living god. She pulled a heavy wooden chest, a container for cleaning linens, and tried to brace it against the simple wooden door. It was a pathetic gesture. She turned to face him in the gloom. "Stay behind me," she whispered, her voice fierce. She spread her arms as if her slender body, draped in fine linen and gold, could possibly stop a cohort of legionaries. She was no longer Augusta, mother of the emperor. She was simply a mother, shielding her child. For a moment in the suffocating dark, the only sound was their own breathing. Then the footsteps stopped just outside their door. A heavy silence fell, more terrifying than the preceding noise. It was the silence of a predator that has cornered its prey. Elagabalus could hear the rasp of breath from the other side of the door, the creak of leather. The wood of the door exploded inwards. It did not swing open. It disintegrated under the force of a single brutal kick. Light and noise flooded the tiny space. Silhouettes of men, broad-shouldered and helmeted, filled the doorway, their forms dark against the bright torchlight from the corridor. He saw the glint of steel, the eagle standards on their shields. His mother screamed, a short, sharp sound that was abruptly cut off. She fell against him, a dead weight. And then the world of sound, the shouting, the splintering wood, the frantic beating of his own heart, simply ceased. There was a pressure, a finality, and then silence, a profound and absolute quiet that swallowed everything. There was no ceremony to their final passage through Rome. They were not bodies, but cargo, wrapped in rough-spun cloth and bundled into a common cart. The journey was made in the grey pre-dawn hours, down the winding roads from the Palatine, past the shuttered Forum, through streets still littered with the detritus of the previous night's celebration of a new Caesar. Rome did not watch. The city held its breath, waiting for the sun. The cart stopped at the Emilian Bridge. The Tiber flowed below, a sluggish, muscular serpent of muddy water, the color of lead and clay. It was the city's artery and its sewer, the carrier of its lifeblood and its waste, a silent witness to its entire history. It had carried the refuse of Romulus's first settlement and the ashes of emperors. It was indifferent. Two figures, their faces lost in the shadows of their cloaks, lifted the first bundle. It was heavy, awkward. With a grunt of effort, they heaved it over the stone parapet. It struck the water not with a clean splash, but with a thick, sodden slap. For a moment it floated, a dark shape in the gloom before the river's current pulled it under. The second bundle followed, smaller and lighter. It vanished almost immediately. The water swirled, eddies forming and dissolving on the surface. A few bubbles rose, and then the river was smooth again, its ancient, patient flow undisturbed. It carried its new secrets downstream towards the sea, dissolving them into the anonymity of its depths. As the cart rumbled away, the first light of the new day broke over the Esquiline hill. It was a dawn of visceral red, the color of blood and wine, and the silken banners of the east. The light touched the high temples and the rooftops of the insulae, spreading across the 7 hills, promising a new day for Rome. The city began to stir, to breathe again, cleansed and quiet. The river flowed on, silent, eternal, having swallowed a god. The sun, a relentless orb of gold, was Elagabalus's obsession. Not the distant, predictable disk that casually traversed the Roman sky, but a vibrant, pulsating entity, perceived in ecstatic visions, a divine power that demanded utter devotion. This was Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, not yet the state-sanctioned deity of later emperors, but a nascent, blazing god in the young emperor's fervent imagination. Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, a name that felt too small for the radiant being he felt himself to be, had ascended the imperial throne at the tender age of 14. His reign, a whirlwind of religious fervor and eccentric rituals, was destined to be short, a fleeting comet streaking across the Roman firmament. But the sun he worshipped, the sun he sought to elevate above all others, held a different kind of permanence. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, a woman of sharp intellect and formidable ambition, had orchestrated his rise. She saw in the boy, then a priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, a vessel for her own power. She, along with his mother, Julia Soemius, a woman whose beauty was as legendary as her devotion to her son, guided him from the temple of Emesa to the Palatine Hill. They recognized the power of faith, a force that could sway armies, forge alliances, and perhaps secure their dynasty. But Elagabalus was not merely a pawn in his family's game. He was a true believer, his young mind alight with the divine. He arrived in Rome not with legions marching, but with the sacred black stone of Elagabal, a meteorite believed to be an embodiment of his god, carried on a golden litter bedecked with jewels. The temples of Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva, venerable pillars of Roman tradition, were to make way. The great god's son, he declared, was to be supreme. His vision was not one of quiet contemplation. It was a grand theatrical spectacle. He himself, clad in silken robes and adorned with glittering jewelry, would lead processions, his dark hair a stark contrast to the imagined golden aura of his deity. He would dance, sing, and offer animal sacrifices, not in the hushed reverence of traditional rites, but with an exuberant, almost wild abandon. The Senate, a body accustomed to staid pronouncements and political maneuvering, found itself bewildered, then scandalized. Gannys, his loyal tutor and confidant, a man of quiet wisdom who had nurtured Elagabalus since childhood, often watched the unfolding events with a mixture of concern and fascination. He remembered the boy who loved to chase dragonflies by the river, whose laughter could fill a courtyard. Now this emperor, cloaked in divine pronouncements, seemed a different entity altogether. Yet beneath the flamboyant exterior, Ganny still saw glimpses of that child, a child driven by an overwhelming, perhaps naive, conviction. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, a contemporary observer, would later record the emperor's more peculiar decrees. Elagabalus, fascinated by gender fluidity and the concept of marriage, took a Vestal virgin, a sacred vow of chastity broken, as his own consort, a scandal that sent ripples of outrage through the established order. He was equally delighted by the idea of being a wife himself, finding favor with a handsome charioteer named Heracles. These were not the pronouncements of a conventional emperor. They were the declarations of a spirit unbound by earthly convention, a spirit captivated by the divine feminine and masculine, mirroring, he believed, the dualistic nature of his sun god. His priesthood was a curious blend of Syrian and Roman traditions. He would officiate ceremonies, his hair shaved in the style of a priest, his body marked with ritualistic tattoos. He introduced a new deity, the goddess Urania, whom he identified with the Syrian Astarte as the consort of Sol Invictus, thereby elevating the sun god even further. The established cults protested. The traditionalists muttered darkly, but Elagabalus, shielded by the fervent devotion of his mother and grandmother, remained undeterred. The mood in Rome was a volatile mix of awe, fear, and ridicule. Some were genuinely captivated by the emperor's divine pronouncements, seeing in him a conduit to a more potent, more vibrant form of worship. Others, particularly the senatorial class and the established priesthood, viewed him with growing apprehension, seeing his actions as a threat to the very fabric of Roman identity. The legions, the true arbiters of power, remained watchful. Julia Maesa, pragmatic as ever, began to sense the shifting tides. The people's adoration, a fickle mistress, was beginning to wane. The initial shock and novelty of Elagabalus's reign had worn off, replaced by an unease, born of his perceived impiety and extravagance. She saw the writing on the wall, a familiar script of imperial downfall. She, along with Julia Soaemias, began to look for a successor, a more stable figure who could restore order and appease the restive populace. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal, as was often the case in the volatile world of Roman succession. The Praetorian Guard, swayed by Julia Maesa's machinations and the growing discontent within the empire, turned against their emperor. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soaemias, were murdered in their palace in 222 AD, their bodies unceremoniously dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber. Their reign, a mere 4 years, was over. The immediate aftermath was a systematic erasure. Elagabalus's reforms were dismantled, his name struck from official records, his statues pulled down. The great god's son was to remain one deity among many, not the supreme ruler of the Roman pantheon. Jupiter would once again hold his place of honor. The black stone of Elagabal was returned to Emesa, its brief sojourn in Rome concluded. Yet the sun, the unconquered sun that Elagabalus had so fervently adored, refused to be entirely extinguished. The idea, the powerful symbolism of a divine solar force, had taken root. It had touched minds, ignited imaginations, and resonated with a primal human need for something greater than themselves. Centuries later, Gaea's empires rose and fell. As Rome itself transformed and ultimately fractured, the cult of Sol Invictus would find new champions. Emperors like Aurelian would embrace it, formalizing its worship and elevating it to a prominent position within the Roman state religion, a testament to its enduring appeal. The sun, in its undeniable power and pervasive presence, remained a potent symbol, a constant in a world of flux. Elagabalus himself became a figure of legend, a byword for decadence and religious extremism. The histories written about him, largely penned by his detractors, painted him as a degenerate and a madman. Yet even in condemnation, his devotion, his absolute certainty in the divine power of the sun, could not be entirely dismissed. As the years flowed into centuries, the grand imperial structures of Rome crumbled, their stones weathered by time and neglect. The intricate rituals of the old gods faded into myth. New faiths, new ways of understanding the divine emerged and took hold. The world Elagabalus had known, a world of marble palaces and senatorial debates, of gladiatorial contests and imperial edicts, was long gone. It was a testament to a different kind of power, not the power of the throne, or the sword, or even the meticulously crafted religious dogma, but the persistent, life-giving power of a simple, radiant truth. Elagabalus had sought to elevate his god, to make him supreme. He had failed in the eyes of the world, but in doing so he had, perhaps unknowingly, pointed the way towards a universal constant, a divine energy that transcended the fleeting reigns of emperors and the changing tides of human belief. And as the moon, a soft pearly disk, began its ascent, casting a gentle luminescence upon a world asleep, one could almost feel the faint echo of that youthful priest, his eyes upturned, bathed in the imagined glory of his radiant god. There was no judgment here, no scandal, no empire's rise or fall, just the quiet hum of existence, the rhythmic pulse of the cosmos, and a profound, serene peace, like the gentle descent of twilight, vast and all-encompassing. The sun indeed outlived it all. Elagabalus's vision, in its purest form, had found its eternal home, not in temples of stone, but in the quiet heart of a sleeping world, bathed in the soft, transcendent glow of the night sky. And in that stillness, there was only acceptance and a deep, abiding peace,